Hi, I'm Sandy Burnett, the Hogwood Fellow of the Academy of Ancient Music, the world-class orchestra that's been leading the way in historically informed recordings and performances ever since 1973. So I'm joined today by the leader of the Academy of Ancient Music, Bojan Cicic, and rather than talking about violin playing, we're going to be concentrating on the art of bowing in Baroque music, because the bow is really the thing which gives the oxygen for string players to animate this fantastic music, the colourful, exuberant repertoire of the Baroque era, that's to say music written between 1600 and 1750. So what's Baroque bowing all about as far as you're concerned?
To come as close as we can to original idea or original sound world of the composer and musicians that lived in that era. So I brought 4 different bows, each of them corresponding to 4 different styles and decades of music. One from first half of the 17th century, one from relative middle of 17th century, then a bow from the very end of that century, and finally a bow that I like the most from sort of high Baroque period.
So where are we going to start?
We're starting with a sonata from Dario Castello's opus in 1629 called Sonate concertate in stil moderno, that was published in Venice posthumously, but before that in Wrocław. And this is the Sonata Prima that doesn't necessarily specify for violin, but just says for soprano solo. So it could be a recorder, cornetto, or a violin, or any other instrument that would play in that pitch.
Great, so let's hear a bit of Castello's music, and Bojan, you're going to be joined by the principal Theorbo player of the Academy of Ancient Music, Bill Carter. So Bojan, that's what Castello sounds like, and this is what it looks like. I mean, the music on the page is actually quite babyish in a way, isn't it? It's quite basic in terms of printing.
Yes, because the technology that they had at the time throughout the 17th century was such that this was the only available printing system until the early 18th century, and particularly Amsterdam, where the new facsimile, what we call now facsimile edition, that is much more closer in looks to a modern edition, started to take place.
But back to the bow. In fact, the bow that you've just been using is in your hands now, and it's really short.
It's a copy from a fresco, I believe, and I always use it for music such as Castello or Monteverdi, because it's very, very agile, very quick, and you realize that the music that is demanded from a musician often is what we call it diminution, a set of very fast, not necessarily always fast, but very precise rhythmic patterns. And that is kind of the easiest way to play on this bow. What is really hard is a long note. So I think it was a rare occasion when somebody just had to play a minim without filling it up with all the diminutions. And probably because technically, I find at least, that that's the most demanding part, to have full control of it. And that's why, as century progressed, more and more such a demand for longer phrases, much more simpler, getting closer to the human voice, I guess, set in the music, and therefore meant that bow makers had to broaden or make the bows longer and facilitate that lyrical part of playing.
So you're going to illustrate that with the second bow you've brought along. And in fact, you had a bit of a drama en route. Would you like to explain to us what happened?
Well, as ever, I always prepare at the last minute. So when I opened the violin case that holds this second bow, which you can see is a bit longer than the first one, that I'm going to use for a music composed in 1660, the point was almost coming out. So earlier today I managed to somehow rehair it. But the reason why it has this elastic band is just to keep the hairs tight for another hour or two before we start filming the actual music.
Wow, so the hair is brand new.
Indeed.
So the music is by Pandolfi Mealli. As you said, it's going to show us the longer, more melodic qualities of the violin, so that's presumably something new in the 1660s. What's the piece of music itself?
It's one of the sonata titled La Cesta, possibly after a composer, Antonio Cesti, that was in Innsbruck, where this music was published in 1660. And it has a wonderful bass line that has almost tragic reminiscences or rhetoric to it that was used throughout the later part of the 17th century, that I find comes as close as we can to a human voice for that period of music.
Right, so we're on to Arcangelo Corelli next, and you've got a longer bow which you think suits his music much better.
Yes, this is a copy of an original that is kept in Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, called Ashmolean number 19, made by a Dutch maker about 15 years ago. The Italians were known for the use of long notes. They called it arcata. So it started to creep in the music around in the second half of the 17th century, and with Corelli it really became a necessity to be able to play a long note and shape the sound the way we are expecting sort of Baroque music to sound nowadays.
Because the funny thing about Corelli is he was an instrumental composer, purely instrumental composer in the land of song. So I guess with the bow you are now emulating the human voice in a way, aren't you?
Yes, and it's also the bowhold that I'm going to use is the one that we're familiar with, called Italian bowhold. Whilst before that I used the early bowhold in the previous two works by Castello and Pandolfi Mealli, simply because this bowhold facilitates this long bow, which I said earlier on that is the hardest thing on a short bow to make the long note to sound freely and maybe even perform a messa di voce or any kind of inflection that we can have by adding pressure to the bow. And I just love playing with this bow because it's not overpowering, especially in combination with the Theorbo, but it has this lyrical quality that I think is essential to Corelli's music.
I mean, it's still very thin and narrow. I mean, the amount of hair is quite narrow. And while we're at the business end down here, the frog, can you just show us how you would loosen and tighten the hair back in those days?
Well, loosening, basically you just put something in here, whether if it's a piece of leather or a paper. It doesn't have a screw mechanism, even though this looks like there is one. You can't really twist it. So basically, it's called a clip-in frog, which means that the frog is taken away. And the previous two bows that I've used also had that 17th century technique. It only happened in high Baroque times that this screw mechanism became more and more important, because it was essential to be able to react to atmospheric conditions that really changed dramatically the tightness of your hairs on the bow. So it's a much more elegant way of doing that rather than putting pieces of paper or leather or taking them out, depending on how the bow reacts to it.
It does look quite rudimentary, I must say.
Well, that is the joy of Baroque instruments, I think, that knowingly we choose to make our life difficult. It's a bit like playing tennis with wooden rackets rather than modern technology.
Which is a thing, isn't it?
Which is a thing. I mean, not that perhaps with tennis it's a bit different, but at least the results in music are, I think, really, really different than a modern bow. You mentioned the amount of hair. This is probably a third amount of hair than a modern bow. And if I have to play on a modern bow, I just don't know what to do with it, because it's so massive, especially the volume that you can produce. It's really, driving a Ferrari all the time.
But the upsides of a bow like that must mean it must be more agile, must be lighter, surely.
Well, with the gut strings that we use on the violin or any string instrument, immediacy of articulation is so much quicker. Not to mention the inflections such as messa di voce that we already mentioned earlier for the long notes. So you can really shape with your right bowing arm, as you said, which is the one coming closest to the voice, in theory, something much more quickly than with a modern bow, which is really meant to present not just the beauty, but also very much a volume in the sound.
So what are we going to hear from Corelli now?
So we're going to hear a sonata published on the 1st of January 1700 in Rome. A very important date. Absolutely. He waited for that date to publish his Opus 5 violin sonatas, 12 of them, probably because he believed that this is the future of music. This is how music will sound from now on, and particularly in England. It had such an influence, not just in England, the rest of Europe, but his style of music, concerti grossi, influenced then Handel, then Gimignani, generation after that. So it really paved the way to what we expect Baroque music nowadays to sound.
So here it is, the Allegro from Corelli's Sonata Opus 5, number 3. So Bojan, your reward for playing so beautifully for us today is to finish up by suffering by playing something incredibly difficult. And this is by Jean-Marie Leclerc, the father of French violin music. I mean, what did he do to transform French Baroque violin playing?
Most of it, I believe, is studying with Solmis, Giovanni Battista Solmis, originally in his youth.
Aha, so he went to Italy to study?
Yes, so he was one of the few, not unheard of, but still one of the few French composers that went to Italy. And in the same way that Couperin tried to do it, or Charpentier, who actually studied in Rome before him, tried to bring in the Italian influence, not just in composing music, but on a violin, in a violin technique. What is interesting is to just think that when Corelli published his Opus 5 sonatas that demanded double stops of a violinist, the violinists in France couldn't really do that at the time.
They could only play one note at a time?
Usually I heard that they played it with two violinists, each of them playing the chord when necessary, one note of the chord, because it was just unheard of to play thirds or sixths in chords that Corelli demanded. And what I find extraordinary is that a generation after that, Leclerc, under very much the influence of Pietro Antonio Locatelli in Amsterdam, totally revolutionized his own playing, and as such the French violin school from that point onwards. Because the next sonata that I'm going to play from his Opus 9, published in 1743 in Paris, pretty much only consists of double stops and very fast trills.
So from our bowing perspective, and we're on to bow number 4, I think this is your favourite bow to perform this kind of music in, isn't it? I mean, how does this bow react to the challenges of playing not just double stops but triple stops? How does that work?
Well, you need a bow that can withstand the demands, so it's at one instance agile, and at the same time being able to be extremely refined in the piano bits. So in a way, you need a bow that can do anything. That really corresponds to, in a way, a modern bow that does the same trick. And if you just have a look, the difference between the first bow and the last one is extraordinary, not just in weight, in length, but the bow hold, the ability, what was it asked from a musician at the time of Monteverdi to the time of Leclerc, is, we call it a Baroque music nowadays, but it's so far apart.
So how much did the technology, the evolution in bows, affect what the music was capable of? Do you think it went kind of hand in hand? They evolved at the same time, do you think?
Yes, undoubtedly so. Makers and composers lived in the same town, and I'm sure they constantly spent time in each other's ateliers, just seeing what was going on, not just for bows but for instruments as well. As ever, human sort of condition is the one that it always experiments, one of curiosity, and perhaps composers got the ideas from the developments in technical ability of each instrument and a bow, perhaps vice versa. But I think it does go hand in hand. There isn't a very clear cut-off point where something changes dramatically and then everybody follows. It's always a space of fluidity that accompanies that.
Bojan, thanks very much. You've taken us from the 1620s in Venice to the 1740s in Paris. It's absolutely an amazing journey. We've learned a lot about bowing along the way. So we're going to end with this incredibly finger-crunching music by Leclerc from his Opus 9, number 6 sonata. Thanks very much, and can't wait to hear it. My thanks again to Bojan Cicic and Bill Carter for their playing on this bowing video as part of the Breaking Down Baroque series for the Academy of Ancient Music. I'm Sandy Burnett. Thanks very much for your company. Do check back for more videos in the series and do let us know what you think.
Thank you.